You would not get any food unless your family or friends or someone would provide that for you. The vast majority of people kept here would actually die of malnutrition, disease. The people most vocal about the witch trials and witchcraft and women are men who feel like they're losing power. James I, who writes on witch trials, is the same with Mathew Hopkins, who writes about witches. Men who have power but feel like there are things going on in the world out of their control, and this is their way of gaining that control back. I mean, I very loosely use the term incel.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Bethnal Archives Podcast. We're here again at the Colchester Jail in the Colchester Castle, here with Ben Paites, the curator. And today we're going to be talking all about the spooky, horrible histories of the Colchester Castle and, of course, the infamous witch trials.
So the kind of belief in witchcraft has existed for kind of many years, centuries, thousands of years. But what we're talking about is a period in kind of 1500s and 1600s where there was an increase in persecution against people believed to be witches. So it was based in a kind of legal framework, which, although there had sort of been laws throughout history around witchcraft in some places at different times, it was quite interesting that at this time in England you have this enshrinement of what witches were and why they should be punished. So it started out under the reign of Henry VIII, and actually nothing really happened under his reign. He created a law that said it was illegal to be a witch, essentially, but no one, at least there are no records of anyone having been sentenced or executed or punished for being a witch at that time. He died 5 years later, and the law was kind of revoked, and then it was under Queen Elizabeth I where you have a law coming in again, and this is where we start to see the first executions. And people were starting to not just be kind of accused of witchcraft as a crime, but obviously dying in quite large numbers as a result of this. In Essex, where we are now, we know that around 750 people were accused throughout that kind of 200-year period. So we're looking actually at about 1550. So it's less than 200 years. About 1550 to the end of the 1600s, there were at least 750 people accused. Around about 100 of those people were executed. And they are kind of the highest numbers in any county at that time, which is why Essex has sometimes been called Witch County, because there are all these stories and legends of so many people being accused and so many people losing their lives as a result of this. And Colchester Castle, where we are, was the epicenter of one of the largest cases of witchcraft execution and accusation that happened throughout that period.
Wow. So before we press on with that, and in that present day of when that happened, let's go back, because you say about witchcraft and, you know, witches has been a thing for hundreds and thousands of years. Like, what was some of the first? What are some of the first records of people being known as witches, and what did that look like then?
Yeah, so magic in kind of earlier days, this concept of altering the world around you through practice, is something more often tied to religion in the early days. So this idea that you could say or sing sometimes or do things that would cause actions to happen in the world around you is often connected to kind of the gods and to religious practice. So for example, in the Roman period, you had temples where you would go and you would ask the gods for help with something, but it wasn't just like in the modern day you kind of pray, you kind of give silent contemplation. If you're in a Christian or kind of a lot of the kind of Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, this idea of prayer is that you kind of almost in silence ask for a thing and hopefully God will give it to you. Back then you actually usually did stuff. So you would go to your temples, you would maybe offer a sacrifice of an animal, maybe offer a sacrifice of money, which is a sort of thing that still persists to this day. Some churches will ask for money, or you kind of do another action. So what we do find in a lot of Roman temples and shrines and things are what we call votive figurines or votive plaques. Some of them will have writing on, so they've just written please can you do this? A lot of them to do with crimes.
Okay.
You get a lot of them. So in Bath, there's one particularly famous one of like, please can you make whoever stole my ring suffer incredible pain and die a painful death, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's to do with health, and you find these little figurines of body parts, and we now believe that was probably they were making these offerings of the part of the body that is sick, ill, injured, etc., and you'd offer it to the gods as a way of hoping that they would heal you in some way. But that is still what we would consider as magic. Although it's a religious practice, we'd still consider that as magic. And there were these priests who were almost like the equivalent of witches, the practitioners, who were facilitating this. However, the Romans still did have a separate concept of a witch, the sagae, and there are stories of them, and they're often related to kind of treatment of the dead.
Okay.
So they would sneak into, or try to sneak into houses where dead bodies were, because quite often back in those days, when a person died, until they were buried, they were kept at home.
Okay.
So they would go into those houses and steal body parts and steal things for their magical practices. So there was this kind of concept of the evil witch in even in Roman times. However, as time went on, and even in the Anglo-Saxon period, they had these magical practitioners, again sort of connected to magic of religion. But it wasn't until much later, until the medieval period, where you get this concept of predominantly women who were living often secluded lives away. It was hardly ever anyone's wife that was doing this. It was always women, independent women, living on their own. Sometimes they were independent because they were widowed, so maybe they had been married but now they weren't, or people who chose not to marry and were living on the fringes of society, and they were the ones who would most often receive these accusations of being witches. Some of them believed that they were kind of magical practitioners. Some of them were actively going out kind of healing. Midwives is quite a common one that comes up. So back then, midwives were basically people, so other women who would go around with herbs and things to try and help women have a safe pregnancy.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have doctors, we didn't have hospitals, we didn't have things like that. So the midwives were the closest thing to magic and witchcraft. But then as kind of time went on, these stories of malicious witchcraft, of cursing, of killing people through magic, it wasn't until really the kind of 1500s where that starts to become a more widespread thing, at least in England.
Yeah. This obviously is going to sound like a silly question, but is there any historical evidence that would suggest that spells that were done had worked in any way?
Interestingly, there sort of is, in the sense that you also get these votive inscriptions saying thank you very much for doing that. So we do have one here in Colchester Castle, I think, actually, which is basically an inscription that was written saying there's usually, with the Roman ones, there's usually this kind of prescriptive style of writing. So it's not kind of a personal, kind of heartfelt message. You usually have to write things in a certain way, and I think that's part of the magic of it.
Right.
Is the idea you have to write things, and there's certain abbreviations as well that are kind of used to kind of invoke certain things. But yeah, there's a plaque that we have that basically says thank you to a god for having accomplished the task, and as a fulfillment of that, I am dedicating this plaque. So what would have happened as well, I guess, is if they said, please can you do this thing for me, if you do it, I will then come back and make another offering. So that's kind of how it works. So you do get these kind of return offerings. So it seems like that is the kind of evidence that they believed that their spell, their kind of magic had worked
as well, yeah.
And they'd gone back and they'd kind of thanked the gods or the priests or whoever for having done it.
That's not what I expected you to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
You expected me to say no?
No, yeah. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So ancient spells that were used, we do have hard evidence to suggest that they at least thought
that it
worked.
They believed that, that at least what they had asked for had come true.
People had done this job for many years, and spells and witchcraft had kind of been accepted almost as just a part of life for thousands of years before. What was going on at that time in England for a law to come into place to say no more?
Okay, so a lot of the time people kind of think, and it did have a part of a role to play in this, a lot of the time people think it's to do with religion.
Yeah.
And Christianity coming in very slowly pushed out any other form of belief.
Yeah.
What's interesting in England is that magical practitioners, witches, whatever you want to call them, were not kind of punished or executed for heresy, which is religious reasons.
Yeah.
They were executed as felons. So it's all to do with the crime of injury or death. So it's this idea that they were causing harm or death or whatever through their magic.
Okay.
Religion does play a little part in it, which I'll get onto in a bit later. But the main reason, weirdly, I think, and I think a lot of historians of witchcraft kind of agree with this as well, is the printing press.
Right.
So we have in the late 1400s the Gutenberg press in Germany, and we have other presses. Printing kind of starts to develop and boom. And what you see is now people are able to put their thoughts and beliefs out into the open almost without any sort of editorial process.
Right. So a little bit like X currently.
A little bit like, very much like social media in all its forms today, in that people were able to write what they wanted and spread it as far and wide if they were wealthy enough to do so.
Okay.
So at that time, almost the written word wasn't quite so much to do with kind of facts and evidence. It was who has the most money.
Right.
You could write whatever you wanted as long as you had enough money to print it and then circulate it across the world.
So someone's personal opinion about maybe what they thought of witchcraft.
Yes.
If they had enough power,
yes,
they could basically say, I think this is a horrible thing. It shouldn't happen anymore.
And that's sort of what happened with the Malleus Maleficarum.
Yeah.
So the Hammer of the Witches, which was published in the late 1400s by Heinrich Kramer, who was a German kind of... It was him and a couple of other people in Germany. Strangely, they were kind of not really believed, or they were kind of not really taken as serious at the time in the area they were living in. They were seen as radicals because they were, but this kind of obsession with witchcraft and magic wasn't seen as like, oh yeah, I agree with that. Let's spread the word. But because they were able to print that book and it was able to be published and it spread far and wide, that's where other countries and other people in other countries started to pick up on this idea of predominantly women are bad, which is the main gist of the book, rather than just witches. It's this idea of parts of a woman or parts of a kind of women's identity needs to be oppressed, and it's because they are dangerous and it's because they're evil. And it's in that book as well where you start to get these kind of ways of testing. How can you prove a woman is a witch? How can you prove someone is doing evil things? Which is where you then have that evidence in air quotes, of how you can prove that someone is this thing. And that's where, and a lot of those tests are complete rubbish. And they are designed to prove that anyone could be a witch, really. But because this book then starts circulating, other people start writing their own books. And it is actually, you see this series of publications from the late 1400s into the 1600s, these different people writing these different books, that's circulating wider and wider. Mathew Hopkins himself wrote a book that would have been circulated quite widely, and people would have probably believed because he was seen as a well-educated... I think that was the thing. I think if you get your stuff in writing, you're almost seen as well-educated. But like I say, you need a certain level of education because you need to be able to write. But also you need the money. So it's not so much about how believable you are that you've managed to get a book out. But yeah, so again, like social media, anyone can write anything on there really, and it depends who reads it as to whether they believe it or not.
And do you think that was also partly because prior to that, most of the people who wrote were men of the cloth, and so there's this sort of almost ingrained idea that people who have the ability to write and print should be trusted?
Yeah, I think so. But even Heinrich Kramer had a religious background. That was his kind of his beginning, and yeah, it's kind of there was this sense, I guess, of religion having this power over language and knowledge, and of course, a lot of stuff in the early days was written in Latin.
Yeah.
So even if you were able to read your own language, unless you could read Latin, you wouldn't be able to understand a lot of the texts that were being published. And that's where I think this, and again with the development of the press, you start to see these multiple languages of a single publication starting to come out. It's not too long after that where you get the Bible published in not Latin or not Greek
Yeah.
for the first time, because people are starting to come to terms, and that is related to religious change going on, the Protestantism, the wave of kind of this religious movement in Europe. But you do start to see that everyday people could read these texts in their own language now, whereas previously it was predominantly in Latin or kind of ancient languages, and again that was to keep it confined to the religious classes.
Yeah. Talking about Cranmer, do we know that, was he a married man? Was he single? Was he someone who had maybe have been heartbroken in some sort of way to sort of create such a piece of literature that was very anti-women?
I think a lot of these people, not just Cranmer and others, I don't know a huge amount of Cranmer's personal history and story, but I know from some of the others. I mean, I very loosely use the term incel. That has now become like a very common word to refer to grumpy men that don't feel like they're getting their own way, essentially. I know it's a lot more nuanced than that, but still, like, there is this element of the people most vocal about the witch trials and witchcraft and women are men who feel like they're losing power, who are men who come from positions of privilege or came from positions of privilege, and whether it's because of that religious change, I think Cranmer perhaps it's coming to do with this movement in Europe of the change away from the Catholic Church and Protestantism being relatively more liberal. It's not hugely, but for the time it's more liberal, and so all of this change is happening and trying to find a scapegoat in a way to kind of vent and get that anger out. And it's the same with James I, who writes on witch trials. It's the same with Mathew Hopkins, who writes about witches. It's the same with all these people, and they are all men who perhaps have power but feel like there are things going on in the world out of their control, and this is their way of gaining that control back.
Yeah.
Which is terrifying, really.
Yeah. Just these things often keep happening.
Oh yeah. I mean, one thing I can say this now. So one of the other things. So we talk about what caused this. One of the things is the printing press and publication. The other two things that happen, which again very much resonates with modern day, and a lot of people don't know about this. This is an interesting part of this kind of period of history. What we also have at the same time, at the peaks of witchcraft accusation, at the peaks of most people being persecuted and executed for being witches, we have sudden unexpected climate change.
Okay.
We have a mini ice age in the early 1600s, and it's after that where we start to see a peak in like sudden changes to kind of accusations, because crops are failing, because people are losing their livelihoods. They need to find someone to blame. They don't understand weather and climate, so they're going to blame witches because that's the only thing in their kind of worldview that could possibly be causing this. The other thing is you have an event that polarizes the country. So we start with the Reformation. Suddenly everyone's Catholic or Protestant. If you're on the wrong side, you're going to get killed. How can we find another scapegoat? Well, witches are causing a lot of the problems. Let's focus our energies on that to try and forget about the divide that's happening elsewhere. Then we have the English Civil War.
Right.
And that's, again, we have Parliament versus the royal family and this kind of tension that happens, and the country is split once again, and people want to find scapegoats. They want to find a different target to focus their energies and their anger on and blame. And they essentially create witches. So this is the other thing I kind of often say is actually witch is really a slur. It would be considered at the time. People practicing magic, people who believed they were practicing magic at the time, would not have called themselves witches. They didn't believe. So witch was a term created by the people who thought that these were evildoers, that they were kind of causing harm, causing death, causing plague, causing everything. So a witch was someone who was, at that time, kind of a bad term. So it's not something those people would have used it for themselves.
How would they have referred to themselves?
Healers, like midwives, all those sorts of terms. That's what they saw themselves as. They saw themselves as people who were helping, who were kind of going out. And they probably, some of them didn't even have a term. They probably were just, I don't know, Anne down the road who can fix your broken leg. Like that sort of thing. It wasn't really this kind of national movement of, there was no witches' church at that time. There was nothing like that. It was
no,
just
like guild or
no, exactly. Like most of the people who were witches wouldn't have known each other. They were kind of this disparate group of people.
And maybe that's also why it was so easy to target them.
Yes.
because he wasn't targeting a body of people, he was targeting anyone he
Exactly.
thought was a bit strange or doing something that you didn't agree with.
Exactly. But if you think of that, if you think of this sudden unexpected climate change and you think of this society divided, very similar to some of the things happening nowadays in lots of parts of the world, really. And we see the same thing happening again. We see scapegoats.
Yeah.
We see communities being targeted. We see people and misinformation about these people going around completely, like even nowadays in the age of technology where you could quite easily Google the fact and find out about something, people believing what they're reading rather than actually speaking to the people who are being talked about and saying, no, these people are evil, these are a scourge of society, we need to get rid of them. And it's just ridiculous that it's kind of happening again and again for the same sorts of background. We've got climate change, we've got societies divided because of politics or whatever, and it's just it's this cycle of history that never seems to end.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. And so that's jumping right into when it was happening.
Yeah, so we don't have a huge number of cases recorded. A lot of the stuff we have is kind of records in court notes that essentially say person's name, accused of witchcraft, executed. So we don't really know what kind of led to that final moment. What we do have is a series of pamphlets. In Essex, we have quite a few actually. But for some of the trials, what they did is at the end of the trials, they produced these documents with a bit of a written account of what happened and these images, so that the general public will know what happened. So again, for those that couldn't read, they had these images, so you knew who the people were and what was happening. But then it also had this written record of the events, leading from them being accused to them probably being executed in most instances. And what seems to have happened quite often is that someone will have something would have happened, like we said, whether it's because of climate change, the crops failed, a family member has died. That's a very common one, especially children. Now, infant mortality at that time was like horrendous. A lot of children didn't survive into adulthood because of malnutrition and so many different reasons. But sometimes people, because they didn't understand how this worked, would blame witchcraft.
Right,
and if, as in some cases, a few days before you'd annoyed your neighbour and then the next day your son dies, you'll think, well, it must be because of Agnes down the road. I called her a name and and now she's cursed my child. And so that's where a lot of these stories start, is there's no grounding in evidence.
Right.
It's just an accusation because of what they believe may have happened. And then they will get the officials involved. Now, the officials can vary from place to place, time to time. During the kind of 1645, Mathew Hopkins was around. Mathew Hopkins was the official. He and some others would take people in. So Colchester Castle here, the jail was used as a place to imprison those people. So he'll bring them here and you would test them.
Yeah.
Now, that's not like... questioning would have been kind of one part of this, but a lot of the time it was essentially torture. In this building. So the cells we are currently in date to the 1700s.
Yeah.
They were used up until the end when the castle ceased being a jail in the early 1900s. We know that there were cells above as well, in the floor above, which no longer exist.
Right.
And of course we have the cells here, and we know that at different times of history, sometimes the cells were mixed, and in the more recent history, the men were kept down here and the women were kept upstairs. Now, the specifics of what happened when Mathew Hopkins was here, we don't know where within the building those people were kept.
Right.
But they were definitely kept in this building.
Yeah.
We know that for sure. So essentially where we are now, whether it was right here or in this building, that was where these people were kept.
Okay. And talk us to us. So he brings them into the coven.
So he brings them in, puts them in a cell. These cells, which they all would have been about the same size as this, could have, not that they should have kept this number of people, but we know that sometimes there's 30, 35 people kept in a single cell, which is a huge number of people. No beds, no furniture, nothing like that, no toilet, no sanitation of any kind. You would not get any food unless your family or friends or someone would provide that for you. which is why the vast majority of people kept here would actually die of malnutrition, disease. There was a lot of respiratory disease in jails, especially here in Colchester. So the environment, you can't see it on the camera, but there is a fireplace in this space that would have been very smoky. That would have kind of caused a lot of problems. Not a lot of ventilation. There's really no windows in the rooms. There's a tiny kind of slit in that one, and wouldn't have really allowed much ventilation at all. So it's kind of a horrible place to be. And what we need to remember is at this point, and this is what jails are as well, just to give a bit of context. Jails are places where people are kept awaiting to be sentenced. Okay. So at this stage, no one knows if they're guilty or not.
Okay. Right.
So you're being kept here in these horrible conditions, and further down the line, you might be found to be innocent.
Okay, yeah.
So for the people having to stay here, would have been an absolutely horrendous situation. In relation to the witch trials, I think what we always say is, of course, everyone was innocent.
Yeah.
In the sense that we know that the people being accused, for the majority, were not people who believed they were practicing magic for a start.
Yeah.
But also those few that we know of who believed they were only doing it for good. They were only healers. They were trying to help people, so they wouldn't have been doing that kind of dark magic, kind of cursing people. That wasn't the thing. So they were kind of completely innocent people being kept here, and many of them dying before they were even allowed to be judged. And that was the other issue, is that at this time, unlike nowadays where we have law courts that are kind of based in a town, they're static, and every day you could go to court and there will be a case going on. That's not necessarily a sign of the increase in crime. That's just to do with the fact that you have these static courts. Back in the day, you had the assizes courts. So what you had to do if you committed a crime, you had to essentially wait until that court came back to your area to then go in front of the judge. Now, you could be waiting for months for this, and you'll be in these prison cells, no food, no sanitation, poor living conditions, everything. And you'd be lucky to survive if you did. And we know a lot of cases where people just didn't.
So, because as you said, most of them were people from the fringes of society who maybe lived alone, so they didn't have family or friends.
No, exactly. So yeah, they didn't have people to kind of provide for them. And also, even if you're accused of witchcraft, there was a certain stigma and fear that perhaps you were, and you wouldn't want to be associated with that. And we know of cases of families turning on each other. We know right here in Colchester Castle, Anne and Rebecca West were under Mathew Hopkins' kind of one of his big trials, one of his big kind of cases, and the daughter Rebecca basically gave evidence against everyone so she could be freed.
Wow. Including
her mother. And yes, so we know from other parts of the country, Pendle, you have a similar story, a young girl giving evidence against her mother. And so this would happen quite often. So even if your family, it didn't mean that they would help you if you were accused of being a witch. But also, on top of that, a lot of these people were elderly, like I say, a lot of widows you have, and a lot of these people were disabled. So Elizabeth Clark, who was one of the group of women with Anne and Rebecca, was an older disabled woman living on the edges of, I think it was Mistley or Manningtree, that area, and was the first person accused in that case. And mainly because she was living on the fringes of society. What was she up to? How could an older woman survive on her own when she's disabled? Surely magic is the only answer to that. So there is this element of misogyny in it as well, this idea that women aren't able to look after themselves, and so must have been magic. That's the only way they could possibly do it. But there's also a lot of people being targeted because they are disabled, because they're vulnerable, and this belief that people can't look after themselves unless they were using magic in some way.
If they felt that they were blaming someone else and put in such turbulent times, maybe they were going to be seen in a better light and ignored or not seen as something they've maybe done wrong themselves in, maybe in the Civil War or...
Well, exactly. There was a lot of...
all of these... religion or...
all of these things coming together. And religion does play a big role in the sense that there are plenty of cases where you have accounts of women gathering, saying strange things in weird languages at night in the dark, kind of hiding from people. And it's because probably they're reading Latin. They're probably Catholics trying to hide their religion in a Protestant period. Because they know if they prove that they're Catholic, they're going to be burnt as heretics. Whereas if they kind of try and hide it, or at least if they're accused of witchcraft, they'll be hung. I don't know if I'd want to choose, but like for some people, maybe hanging is a quicker death because they know that a lot of the time when people were hung, people would come forward and tug them to kind of make it quicker. Whereas if you're burning at the stake, it's a long, slow, painful, absolutely nothing really you could do about it, apart from in a few instances we know of where people would put gunpowder kind of either around the necks or kind of with the person, so that as soon as the fire hit, they'd just go up and then it would be quick and hopefully they wouldn't suffer so much. It's a horrible kind of dilemma to be in, but we know that religion did play a slight role in it, and a lot of people being accused were probably actually secret Catholics. And that is the interesting thing as well, is that has sort of persisted to this day, this idea of Latin being associated with magic.
Yes,
you often, like demonic kind of spells and stuff you see in movies and things, it's always in Latin.
Yeah, that's true.
And so it's that's something that has kind of survived kind of through the centuries, is this connection between Latin and religious practice and what was believed to be witchcraft at the time.
When Mathew Hopkins was testing them, let's talk around that. Let's talk about like his actual methods and maybe the deceptions that he was and why that was.
Yeah, so it's interesting. In his book Demonology, he does write about the kind of methods of testing and the fact that there were people faking it. So we know that there were people faking it because Mathew Hopkins said that there were people faking it.
And they were faking it because you got paid to provide witches.
However, he's writing it in a way of saying, don't do this, don't fake it, we need to be authentic, we need to be genuine. However, undoubtedly he himself was doing some of these things. Like we have an illustration of so pricking is one of the tests they did. So that's where you prick a point on the witch. Usually marks, so they're called devil's marks, but they were probably moles, skin tags, all the usual stuff that we understand now, just normal part of human body. Back then, they still would have had an awareness that this is just a normal part of the human body, but they needed something to target their kind of accusation against. And so they looked for these marks and they pricked them. And the idea was that if the person bled, they weren't a witch. And if they didn't bleed, then the devil was protecting them.
Right.
Or at times it was to do with if they shouted out in pain. If they didn't feel the pain, then they were a witch because the devil was protecting them. There's certain variations of basically the same thing that kind of happen at different points. The idea is you prick someone, and depending on their reaction tells you whether they're a witch or not. That's their form of evidence, even though we know that it's complete rubbish. Now, like the idea of pricking someone, their reaction meaning anything other than they're in pain or not, doesn't really mean anything nowadays. But they tried to use this as a way of testing people, and it became quite a common occurrence, to the extent that they had these fake prickers to be able to get away with it. Whether that was retractable needles, they had these. It reminds me of there used to be the popular thing of like the arrowhead the arrow goes through your head. It's got like a band that goes around it. They had that as a pricker. So you'd put it on a person's finger, and then you say to someone else, "Look, it's gone through their finger, and they're not feeling any pain." And it would look like they'd been completely stabbed through, but actually it was a complete illusion. So they were creating these things to try and get away with accusation, because they were so desperate to find these people and accuse them and eventually execute them for witchcraft. And then, of course, at the end of the day, they'd say, well, they're witches, they can use magic and do what they want anyway. So it's almost like, well, some of this testing is completely pointless, because if you do believe they are witches and they can manipulate things with magic, then none of your testing would be valid anyway. The other thing was walking. So you would get them to walk around the cell constantly, and I imagine you would have a rota of guards, making sure, because otherwise the guards couldn't stay up the whole time, but day and night constantly walking until the person got to the point where they just gave over their guilt just because they were so tired. And again, that's a common form of torture, is kind of doing something to a person so intensely and for such a long time that they just give in the end. Now, interestingly, torture was illegal at the time. So actual torture was illegal. But they got around it by doing things like this, because they could say, well, we're not torturing them, we're just forcing them to walk. But it was kind of frowned upon by the authorities, was ducking. So that's where you usually you tie the thumb and the opposing toe, both of them together, throw the person in the water, and then if they float, they're a witch because the devil is rejecting their body. the water's rejecting the devil in their body, or they drown, but it's fine because they were innocent, so they've gone to heaven.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter.
Right.
So it's a kind of lose-lose situation, really. But you had this form of testing that did happen from time to time, and it actually happened in Essex up until the 1800s. We have an account of a man, interestingly, being ducked in Essex in the 1800s. He was an older, possibly French immigrant who was accused of witchcraft by someone. And rather than going to the authorities, because at that point it was illegal, so by the 1800s it was illegal to even suggest someone was a witch without evidence.
Okay. Yeah.
So it had shifted a little bit. So they had this thing, and the man was sadly thrown in a river because they'd heard of this account of ducking and being able to test to see if someone was a witch. He did survive, but because he was kind of quite a bit older, he died of pneumonia quite a few weeks later. But that was in the 1800s. That's quite a late account of that practice happening. But it happened for a long time. But the authorities said it was rubbish for a lot of it. They said this is ridiculous. They didn't do it as a practice. It was something that local people might do because they've heard of this as a test and they wanted to deal with it quickly because they were so terrified. Yeah. I think this is the other thing. Like, we talk about it now and we understand how ridiculous some of it was and how much of an overreaction some of it was. Yeah. But at the same time, a lot of these people were living in genuine fear. They believed it was real. They believed a witch could live next door and kill you and your family. So of course you'd want to do something to protect them. I'm not excusing what they did in any way, but you can understand where that came from.
Yeah.
I think so. About 750 people we know of were accused of witchcraft in Essex.
Yeah.
About 100 of those were executed. So that means 650 were innocent, or believed to be innocent, and kind of were let loose.
Are they sort of shown to be innocent?
Lack of evidence, usually.
Oh, really?
I think that's the main thing, and it was kind of this idea that although there were these tests, I'm sure at times those tests didn't work, and so they had nothing but to say, well, it's not worked. We'll have to kind of say that they're innocent because they couldn't prove it, and testimony from others.
Yeah.
So again, Rebecca West was allowed to escape because she gave testimony against the others. So most of the others were executed, but she was allowed to go free. You do see repeat offenders, which is interesting. Names come up multiple times.
Yeah.
Some of the times, very interestingly, I'm sure there'll be some supernatural believers out there who could think these are like the ghosts or like long living witches, but like a century apart you get the same name coming up. Now I think it's just two people with the same name who happen to be back then there were only a certain number of names that you probably would have been called. There's about 100 Anns and like loads of different other people, but like you do get these repeated names that come up, and some of them come up close together in time. So clearly they're these repeat offenders where people keep making accusations against them. They keep finding themselves back at court, but they keep getting away with it and they keep kind of being freed, thankfully, because again they are innocent. They haven't done anything. But they are kind of the few who seem to be kind of in this repeat cycle of being caught. A lot of people are one-offs, and I think probably a lot of the time, as we said, people would see through the fact that this is a neighbour, they're a bit disgruntled, something's clearly happened that's annoyed them. There's no evidence that this person has done any sort of magic or witchcraft beforehand. Yeah. So we don't think it's that. We think something else is going on. So they would have been let off. And as the law changes, the kind of the accusations and things change as well. So it's under James I where this new kind of law comes in. It's a lot stricter. But it also ties in with this concept of wicked spirits, which are what we nowadays would consider to be familiars. Okay. So the little animals that kind of scurry around with the witches. So we kind of see this idea as the black cat more than anything. Black cat is that kind of iconic symbol of witchcraft and the witch's companion. But at the time, the most common familiars that were recorded in cases are things like frogs and ferrets and basically anything you'd find out in the wilds that could be spotted near someone's house. So a lot of the time this isn't the person's familiar, i.e. they had them as a pet, say, for want of a better word. Yeah. These are just animals that were around And so anyone could say, well, I saw a frog near Agnes's house the other day.
Familiar.
That must be her familiar, and therefore she's a witch. We should probably go and kill her.
Yeah.
So they kind of, that law kind of created this new way of accusing people. But then when it eventually got to court, how are you going to prove that?
Yeah.
How are you going to prove that there was a familiar, let alone an animal, near that person's house? Which is why familiars sort of become the secondary evidence eventually. The accusations are about this person killed someone, this person hurt someone, this person caused them to be sick. Oh, they also had a frog near them. That's sort of how it developed. But again, it can be used as non-evidence. You can say, well, there's no proof that they have a familiar. There's no proof that there's anything connected to this person. And that's why by kind of 1735, the final Witchcraft Act, it became illegal to accuse someone of witchcraft without evidence, because there were so many of these cases coming up, and they were just saying there's nothing, you can't prove this, that they actually had to create a law saying if you accuse someone, you say they're a witch and you have no evidence, you yourself will be punished.
Right.
Not executed, but those people could be imprisoned or fined or something for suggesting someone is a witch without the evidence. So we see over this kind of century and a half this shift from paranoia, there must be witches everywhere, how are we going to deal with it, to this is getting ridiculous, everyone's accusing everyone of witchcraft, let's stop it.
Yeah.
So you do see this interesting evolution of how the law changes to reflect people's belief about the reality of witchcraft at the time.
Obviously, once again, I'm going to say a silly question.
No such thing.
This will be a silly question, but was there any accounts ever anywhere that were proven that someone who was accused of witchcraft, whether it was magic or not, had actually done the crime that they were suggested of doing?
Not that I'm aware of. So again, most of the time when people are proved to be guilty, it's not to do with, it's weird, it's not to do with the crime they're accused of. So very rarely will you have someone say, I believe this person has killed my child through witchcraft, and they've managed to prove that the child was killed through witchcraft. Most of the time they've proved that person was a witch.
Right.
So the person will be accused of having done something.
Yeah.
Then they'll prick them, dunk them, whatever. They'll say, yep, they're definitely a witch. And therefore, I guess by association, they believe they probably did it. So therefore, they'll be executed because of it. But yeah, there's no cases where they've said, oh, well, we definitely know that this person caused the death of this person, or the sickness of this person, or harm to this person, or the crops failing. Because you couldn't prove that.
Yeah.
Because, to be fair, they didn't do it. So you wouldn't have that evidence.
Yeah. Let's talk about the witch marks that we have here in the castle.
Yes. So one of the things you kind of can spot as you go around Colchester Castle are witch marks. Some of them take different forms, but the most common one is described as the daisy wheel. So it's kind of a loop of 6 kind of loops within a circle. And that is found on lots of different buildings. You find them in a lot of historic buildings. They're believed to be to ward off witches, so to keep them away.
Yeah.
And given that Mathew Hopkins was here imprisoning people suspected of witchcraft, you can understand why someone might have put that mark in the building to kind of keep any protection against that bad magic. However, at the same time, quite a lot of people have suggested actually these are just building marks. They're nothing to do with witchcraft. And the witchcraft idea is a more modern folkloric kind of interpretation of what they are.
Yeah.
But we do know that people did put marks into buildings for magical protection.
Yeah.
They did all sorts of other things. They put money into building foundations sometimes to provide, to kind of give magic. I mean, this is another thing. This is the kind of funny thing I always think about is actually at the time, although witches and witchcraft was seen as evil and bad, a lot of people would resort to magic to protect themselves from witchcraft, because these witch marks are effectively magic. This is the idea, is that you do a thing to somehow protect you from something.
Yeah.
Similar with witch bottles. So witch bottles are another common occurrence. We didn't have any in the castle here, but we have some in our collection from other buildings, and they are kind of magical objects used by people who weren't witches. They were used to protect a house or a pub or whatever against witches, and yet the irony is they're using magic to protect themselves from what they're fearing.
Yeah.
It's this kind of this kind of hypocrisy that you see quite often happen. And of course, often men are allowed to practice. So you get these kind of figures like John Dee, who was at the court of Queen Elizabeth I, and he was an alchemist. He was kind of doing all these practices. He was even given money by Elizabeth I to go off and travel and look into the occult.
Right, yeah.
But he was a man with power and money, so
Right,
of course
yeah.
he was allowed to.
But a woman would have been
A woman was not allowed to do that.
hung.
Exactly. So this is the thing. You see a lot of the hypocrisy and a lot of the kind of inconsistencies with the stories around belief in magic and witchcraft, which is why, more than anything, it proves that a lot of the laws, a lot of the writing that was happening at that time is pure misogyny. It's pure ableism. It's pure anyone who's different and living on the fringes of society shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't exist. How are they doing that? Let's kill them. That's kind of what it kind of boils down to. But then, as I said, eventually they realized how ridiculous that was and how difficult a thing it was to prove. And so the law again changes as time goes on to kind of show, actually, we're realizing this is ridiculous. This isn't something you can prove.
Okay, that's we've heard a lot about the witches. It's been really insightful and interesting. Let's move on to more of the spookiness and paranormal stuff that happens around the castle.
Yeah, so there's kind of a layering to the castle we have here. So as you mentioned, the foundations are Roman. The walls around us are technically Roman in the sense that they're made from Roman building material, but they were recycled. So in the 1070s, when the Normans arrived, they built this building from what they could find nearby. And then the roof was from the 1600s, which was a completely different period as well. So you have this kind of layered, textured kind of thing to the building itself, which kind of lends to this idea of kind of the multiple periods of history and different stories and kind of different experiences. I think people also have a lot of misconceptions about the building. So the reason the roof is the way it is because at a long time people thought the whole building was Roman. They thought the Norman keep was Roman, and it had been like that for what would now be 2,000 years. Whereas actually what happened was it was demolished and then rebuilt, and kind of has these phases of construction. So I think a lot of people have this sense of what they believe Colchester Castle is, what its history is.
Yeah.
And that definitely has led to a lot of stories that I would say are 100% wrong.
Yeah.
So there are ghost stories where you're like, oh yeah, and then the person who walked in this area and did this, and I'm like, that wouldn't have existed at that time. So I don't think so. The one classic story is that someone apparently, I think it was in the 1970s, saw a Roman figure walking through in the foundations, and of course the foundations were filled with sand throughout the entire time that the temple existed. So people wouldn't have been walking down there.
Yeah.
So how a ghost got down there, I don't know. I mean, some people believe that ghosts can travel and they can move about into different places. If you believe in the kind of stone tape kind of theory and that kind of echo theory, then of course they're tied to the place, so they wouldn't be down there. So it all depends on your perspective on what these phenomena are as to whether you think they are accurate or real or not. But I do think that was just very much that person knew that Romans are connected to this building, and so they thought, they must have been. That's where the Roman bit was, so that's where the Romans were, and so they kind of had this story of a Roman person walking through the foundations. But similarly, you get a lot of stories of accounts of genuine kind of things that have happened. The kind of the two key stories, other than the witch trials, which we've talked about, are the story of James Parnell, who was a Quaker who was imprisoned here. And sadly lost his life. He was only 19. He was very young. He lost his life because he was imprisoned in what was called the Little Ease. So it's basically like an oubliette, which is a type of hole in the ground. Essentially, you put someone in there, forget about them. From the French oublier, to forget. So you kind of have this person imprisoned here. And he grew kind of steadily sick and kind of frail because he wasn't eating. He wasn't given any kind of food or water. One day he fell from the kind of rope ladder essentially that they had to allow people to get up and out every so often, and broke his arm and probably other parts of his body, and obviously wouldn't have been checked by a doctor or anything. He probably had internal bleeding. Who knows what happened to him, but he died not long after that. And people have said they've spotted a young kind of male figure in places in the castle. And the other two are Lucas and Lyle. So George Lyle and Charles Lucas, who were the royalist leaders during the siege of Colchester in 1648, and they were imprisoned here briefly after the siege, and they were taken out to the back of Colchester Castle and executed by firing squad. So they're kind of connected to the story here as well. And people have accounts of seeing these two figures walking down the Great Stairs or in other places. The story of them walking down the Great Stairs, I don't know. We don't know where they were kept in the building. There is a painting, I think from the 1800s, so quite a while afterwards, of the two walking down the Great Stairs. Now, I don't know whether that is true or whether people have seen that and that's kind of fed into the psyche of, oh, this is what happened to them. And so these stories of the ghosts coming down the stairs have come from that painting. I don't know. But there's definitely this kind of, those are the kind of key stories that we seem to keep coming across, at least tied to people that we know of.
Yeah. And tell us about the story of the guy who stayed here overnight.
Yeah, so that is a more contemporary ghost story. So I believe it was kind of in the early 1900s. So the castle had only been a museum for a little while. Part of it was a museum at this point.
Yeah.
Now, what would often happen is that kind of the curator or whoever was in charge of the museum would sometimes kind of stay in the buildings or would have access to the buildings. Now, he didn't with the castle, but one day someone asked whether they could spend the night in the castle. Now, interestingly, we have sleepovers here all the time now, and this hasn't happened to anyone else since. But he was given permission to spend the night in the castle, and he did. And about 10 o'clock at night, there were some people walking along the high street, at which point there weren't the buildings that are there now. So you could see the castle from the high street at that time. So they were walking along the high street and they saw a figure at the top of the castle. And they thought, what's someone doing up there? There shouldn't be anyone in the castle this time of night. So they went closer, and what they saw was a man on the roof, kind of running backwards and forwards, screaming. They alerted the authorities. The fire brigade, I believe, came, or what was the equivalent of the fire brigade at that time, some with massive ladders, essentially. Yeah. They came and managed to get up to the roof and carry this man down. Now, the story goes that what happened was he eventually was taken to what was referred to at the time as the asylum.
Right.
And a few weeks later, he died. No one ever found out. No one was ever able to find out what he had seen, what had happened to him. But this story has kind of persisted as a something that kind of is still unexplained, and there's still a lot of it because no one really knows why he was there. Even they don't know why he wanted to spend the night in the castle in the first place. Was he doing paranormal investigation himself? Did he just love history and want to sleep in a castle for one night? We don't really know. Yeah. But what happened to him supposedly is quite terrifying, and a lot of people have used that because obviously that story doesn't involve any ghosts. It only involves the man staying there and screaming and going away. People have suggested it's because of what he saw while he was in here that possibly caused him to have that reaction. But yeah, it's a very interesting story.
Yeah, wish we could communicate with him in some sort of way and
find out
what he saw.
What happened. Yeah.
And yourself, have you ever experienced anything paranormal, unexplained here at the castle?
So I have been working here for 10 years now. I have worked many events where I've been here late at night. I've been here in the dark, in the prisons especially, in the dark on my own, essentially, apart from maybe one other member of staff in another area. The light and sound display that we have in the prisons will sometimes trigger without anyone down here. And
it's off a motion sensor.
It's a motion sensor, yeah. So it would take something to kind of make it go. So for example, right now we have the sensor turned around, and not one point has it triggered while we've been in here. So it takes kind of, if you had it kind of turned off, it takes kind of an obvious movement or something in front of it to make it go. Like a bit of like dust falling in front of it's not gonna trigger it. You need a person coming into the room to be able to make it go off.
Yeah.
The other thing is when I was working an event a couple of years ago, there was only me and two other members of staff in the building. We were all in the office, which is kind of tucked away behind the gift shop, so it's kind of out the way. There was 100% no one else in the building because we'd locked up after opening. We were waiting for the event that evening, and we were just sort of sitting and chatting. And I sort of first felt and then saw something like a shadow go past the door to my right. and was so convinced that it was something that I got up and went to have a look, because I was certain that person was in the building. I was so sure that there was enough of a presence there that I was like, oh, that must be someone here. So I got up and went. Absolutely no one else.
Yeah.
Went and had a walk around, no one else in the building. Front door still locked, no one else was here. That is the closest thing I have had to that sort of kind of paranormal encounter.
Yeah.
Still don't know what it was. But it was just this kind of strange experience that I had whilst I've been here. But like I say, in the 10 years I've been here, that's it really. It's not been much else.
Yeah.
But there again, you do get people say they have stories, they have encounters, and they've heard things, seen things, smell things. So there's, with holly trees, there's a smell of, I can't remember what it was, a particular flower that apparently people have on a certain floor, and they think that's connected to one of the women that lived there at one point. But it's not as kind of messed up architecturally as Colchester Castle is. But we've had fewer paranormal investigations at Holly Trees. I think most of it has always focused on the castle because people have asked us, can we look at the castle?
Yeah.
But there have, in more recent years, a few people have requested to look over at Holly Trees as well. Again, I don't know of any specific activity that anyone's recorded or kind of experienced, but it's a similar thing in that it's this historic building. People will probably assume there's a history to it, there's going to be these energies to it, and so maybe part of it is the build up of this idea of what could be there, rather than anyone's actual experiences of seeing anything or hearing anything. But as I've said before on many occasions, I'm always open-minded to anything. I think as we've talked about kind of with a lot of these things, there's this element of belief, there's this element of kind of what we observe and the evidence, and I think more than anything is proof that something is happening.
Yeah. There
are these things out there that people are experiencing, feeling, hearing, smelling, seeing. What they are and how they manifest, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
But there is clearly something happening.
Yeah. And that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember to like, subscribe and comment if you've enjoyed the videos, and we'll see you next time.